Welcome to another Standard Deviations podcast. Imagine for just a moment a world where simply stepping out into the sunlight literally shreds your DNA to pieces.
Right. Which sounds like science fiction, but
Yeah, exactly.
okay.
But that was actually the harsh reality for the very first living organisms on Earth. And strangely enough, it's the exact reason you were going to fall asleep tonight.
It is. It's wild to think about.
Because, we usually treat sleep as this psychological phenomenon, don't we? Like a mental break or a time for dreaming or just a way to cure that heavy brain fog after a long day of meetings. We almost exclusively view it through the lens of the brain.
We do, yeah. And today we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating source document. It's titled The Evolution of Sleep, From Molecular Maintenance to Behavioral Slumber. And let me tell you, it completely dismantles that brain-centric view.
Totally tears it down.
Yeah. It forces a total reevaluation of what you're actually doing for a third of your life. So the goal of this deep dive is to basically step away from the mind entirely. We want to trace the purely biological, chemical logic of sleep. Right. And to do that, we're following an evolutionary thread. One that starts with ancient, single-celled microbes in the primordial soup and tracks all the way up through the incredibly complex architecture of modern humans.
Because the core premise here is that sleep is not some luxury feature. It wasn't just added later in the evolutionary timeline for higher-order animals with big brains.
No, not at all.
It's essentially a mandatory social contract between trillions of cells to synchronize their internal chores.
A social contract, exactly. And to understand why that cellular contract exists in the first place, we really have to look at the environment those first single-celled organisms evolved in.
Right, like long before complex nervous systems were even a possibility.
Exactly. Because in that primordial world, what we're calling proto-sleep was a brutal, non-negotiable chemical necessity. It wasn't a choice.
And that necessity was entirely driven by the sun. The source highlights the unrelenting 24-hour cycle of solar radiation as the original catalyst for all of this.
Yeah, so let's look at ancient cyanobacteria.
Yeah.
The basic chemical processes required for life are, well, they're frequently incompatible with each other when you try to run them simultaneously.
They clash.
They do. And the most critical early conflict was between the sun's ultraviolet radiation and the organism's own genetic material. UV radiation in that early Earth atmosphere was incredibly intense.
Because there was no ozone layer.
Right. No protection. So the UV acted as a highly potent mutagen. It literally physically breaks the chemical bonds in DNA strands.
Which means if a single-celled organism attempts to replicate its DNA during the day,
while it's actively being bombarded by UV light, yeah.
right, the replication process incorporates massive lethal mutations.
Exactly. It's just a biological death sentence. So evolution's workaround for this was the creation of a molecular clock, a rudimentary internal timing mechanism.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the cell had to physically restrict the incredibly vulnerable process of DNA replication entirely to the dark hours. The organism basically learned to wait for nightfall to unzip and duplicate its genetic code safely.
So that is the very first instance of a biological night shift.
That's it. That's the origin.
But the document moves beyond just, hiding from the sun. There is a much deeper metabolic conflict at play here, which brings us to redox homeostasis.
Right, and this gets to the mechanical heart of why any cell, anywhere, requires downtime, because cellular metabolism is it's messy.
Very messy.
Turning nutrients into usable energy creates these corrosive byproducts called reactive oxygen species, or ROS. You can think of ROS as toxic cellular exhaust.
Okay.
So if a cell is performing high-level active output, like maybe it's photosynthesizing or moving its flagella to navigate around, it's running its engine really hot, and it's generating massive amounts of this corrosive exhaust.
Right.
And a cell just cannot physically sustain that active output while simultaneously trying to clean up the toxicity and perform deep tissue repair. It's one or the other.
Okay, let's unpack this. Think of a single cell like a massive, incredibly busy highway. During the day, it is rush hour, right?
Oh, I like this analogy.
Yeah, so traffic is flowing, commerce is happening, energy is being burned at a massive rate. But all that heavy traffic creates severe wear and tear on the asphalt. It creates giant potholes.
Right, the ROS exhaust.
Exactly. Now, you cannot do major road reconstruction during rush hour with cars flying by at 80 miles an hour. You'd cause a massive fatal pileup.
The physics of it just don't work.
They don't. You absolutely have to shut down the lanes, stop the active traffic, and bring in the specialized construction crews to fix the potholes. And in the cellular world, Those crews are doing DNA repair and protein folding.
That is spot on. And taking that highway analogy a step further, the shift from open traffic to construction mode is dictated by an actual shift in gene expression.
Wait, really? The genes themselves?
Yeah, the ancient cell actually downregulates the genes responsible for active interaction with the environment, and it upregulates the genes responsible for internal maintenance.
Wow.
So it's a fundamental reorganization of the cell's internal priorities.
Okay, so if a single cell simply flips a genetic switch to close the highway lanes, what happens when cells start teaming up? Like, when we look at early multicellular life, how do they communicate that it's time to shut down the lanes without the entire organism just falling apart?
That is the million-dollar question. Because the transition from isolated cells into early multicellular clusters, like ancient sponges or simple jellyfish, it created a massive biological tension.
How so?
Well, think about it. If one cell has reached its metabolic limit and shifts into maintenance mode, but the cell right next to it is highly active and demanding chemical resources, the tissue basically tears itself apart functionally.
Yeah, they're out of sync.
Right. They needed a localized way to broadcast exhaustion to the surrounding area.
And evolution utilized adenosine for this broadcast.
Yeah.
Which is funny because we're all familiar with adenosine's arch nemesis, caffeine.
Oh, definitely.
But the molecule itself is the absolute key to this cellular communication.
It is. We know that as a cell does work, it burns through its energy stores, usually ATP, and the leftover chemical byproduct of that energy expenditure is adenosine.
Like an ash left over from a fire.
Exactly. And it steadily builds up in the extracellular space around the working cell. So in these early, simple animals that just have a decentralized nerve net, that localized pooling of adenosine physically binds to receptors on neighboring cells.
Which acts as a signal.
An inhibitory signal, yeah. It essentially broadcasts that the localized metabolic debt is getting dangerously high, and that forces the surrounding tissue network to quiet its activity and pay back the debt.
And the source material uses the Cassiopeia jellyfish to illustrate this, which is just fascinating, because they enter a sleep-like state without having a centralized brain at all.
Right, no brain whatsoever.
Their pulsing bell just slows down, and their responsiveness to the water current drops.
Yeah, researchers observed that the jellyfish's network of cells is just hitting a threshold of metabolic debt. The local tissues themselves are demanding the rest period to clear the adenosine and replenish their energy stores.
So what does this all mean? Basically, adenosine is functioning like the ultimate biological low battery indicator on a smartphone.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Once you've been running heavy apps all day and the battery drops to 1%, the phone's operating system automatically dims the screen. It force quits background processes to save the hardware from dying.
It forces the tissue into power-saving mode.
Exactly. But wait, I actually have to push back here for a second. If sleep is purely driven by local cellular exhaustion, this bottom-up buildup of adenosine, then why don't isolated parts of my body just pass out when they are overworked?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Like, if I'm doing heavy squats at the gym, my quads are accumulating massive metabolic debt. Why don't my legs just enter local sleep right there on the mat while my brain stays perfectly awake?
Well, that specific vulnerability is the exact reason evolution had to completely overhaul the system as animals became more complex.
Oh, so the rules change.
They had to. Local bottom-up sleep works perfectly for a jellyfish drifting in the current. But once organisms evolved, highly specialized organs, lungs, hearts, specialized limbs for running local sleep, became a fatal liability.
Because of predators.
Precisely. If a predator is stalking you and your eyes and brain are wide awake scanning the horizon, but your leg muscles have accumulated too much adenosine and just independently decided to enter a sleep state.
You can't run.
You can't run, you're eaten instantly.
Wow. So the sheer complexity of our bodies means a localized shutdown would crash the entire survival system.
Which means evolution had to invent a centralized dictator.
A dictator.
Yeah, it had to ensure that if the organism is going to shut down for cellular repairs, the entire system does it simultaneously. No rogue cells.
Got it.
In complex vertebrates, that dictator is the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN. It's a tiny region in the hypothalamus.
And what does it do?
Well, the SCN taps into the visual system to sense the rising and setting of the sun, reverting right back to that ancient environmental cue from the cyanobacteria days. And it uses systemic hormones to broadcast a unified top-down mandate to the entire body.
The SCN uses melatonin to synchronize the system, right?
Exactly. It floods the system with melatonin to override those local adenosine signals. It doesn't matter if your arm muscles aren't perfectly exhausted yet. When the SEN sends the signal, every single cell in the organism is ordered to begin its maintenance phase at the exact same moment.
But wait, shutting down the active output of every cell simultaneously creates a macroscopic problem. The entire animal becomes physically incapacitated.
Highly vulnerable, yes. The organism is essentially paralyzed while its cellular infrastructure undergoes repair.
Which is terrifying in the wild.
Oh, absolutely. That vulnerability forced a massive behavioral adaptation. The animal must actively seek out a secure, hidden location. It has to close its sensory gates to the world, which we experience as shutting our eyes. And it has to remain completely immobile to avoid drawing attention.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Looking through this purely biological lens, the actual physical act of going to bed, getting under the covers, turning off the lights, closing your eyes, lying completely still, is entirely a behavioral side effect.
Yes, that's secondary.
We only perform those actions to create a secure, immobile fortress so our individual cells can perform their molecular chores in peace without us wandering into a predator or falling off a cliff.
Exactly. The behavioral state we identify as slumber is nothing more than a protective shell. The actual mechanics of sleep are microscopic. They're happening deep down within the tissues.
Okay, so since the entire body is locked away in this behavioral fortress and everything is perfectly synchronized, what is our most metabolically expensive organ doing? Because the human brain consumes a massive amount of our daily energy budget.
It does. It's an energy hog. And because of that massive energy consumption, the waking brain generates an unprecedented amount of molecular trash.
The ROS exhaust we talked about earlier.
Yes, but also other things. Every time a neuron fires, processing sensory input or solving a problem, it generates those toxic metabolic byproducts. And a key byproduct highlighted in the research is beta amyloid.
Which is pretty famous in neurobiology circles.
Very much so. During high daytime activity, beta amyloid steadily accumulates in the interstitial spaces between neurons. If it isn't aggressively cleared out, it aggregates into plaques that are highly toxic to neural tissue.
And those plaques are deeply implicated in severe neurodegenerative diseases.
Exactly. So the brain cannot afford to let that stuff stick around.
So the brain needs a specialized waste management system that the rest of the body doesn't even require.
Right. And it utilizes something called the glymphatic system. The mechanics of this are just stunning.
How does it work?
During deep, slow-wave sleep, the brain actually undergoes a profound physical transformation. The glial cells, those are the structural support cells surrounding the neurons, they actually shrink in volume.
They physically get smaller.
They do. And this physical contraction causes the interstitial spaces between the neurons to expand by up to 60%.
Whoa. So the internal architecture of the brain physically opens up.
It basically opens the floodgates. By expanding those spaces, cerebrospinal fluid is able to pulse rapidly through the brain tissue, literally riding the rhythm of our arterial pulse.
Amazing.
It mechanically sweeps away the beta amyloid and other accumulated metabolic grime. It flushes it out of the central nervous system and into the body's peripheral circulatory system to be processed by the liver.
So the glymphatic system is quite literally a biological dishwasher.
That is a perfect analogy.
You load it up with dirty dishes, the metabolic grime, all day long, but it can't run while you're actively adding plates to it.
Right, the door's open.
Exactly. So at night, you close the door, the internal racks physically open up 60% wider, and the fluid forcefully sprays out all the toxic buildup so the machinery doesn't degrade.
That's exactly what's happening. The fluid dynamics of that system are absolutely essential for long-term neural survival. But physical sanitation isn't the brain's only problem during sleep.
What else is there?
Well, it also has to manage the sheer informational clutter of our daily experiences. Every single time you learn something new or experience a novel environment, your brain forms new neural connections, new synapses.
Which brings us to the synaptic homeostasis hypothesis, or SHY.
Yes, SHY.
Because we are constantly forming synapses every waking second of the day.
We are, but the physical reality of the skull dictates that we cannot endlessly form new connections.
We'd run out of room.
We'd run out of room, and maintaining a synapse requires a tremendous amount of cellular energy. If the brain just kept wiring new connections all day without any regulatory mechanism, it would quickly exhaust its energy supply.
Right.
And not only that, the sheer amount of signal noise would completely overwhelm our cognitive functions.
Okay, so how does the brain know which connections to keep and which ones to discard?
Well, SHY proposes a mechanism called global synaptic downscaling.
Downscaling.
Yeah. During the day, the connections you use frequently, like the important survival skills or the complex task you're really focusing on at work, they become structurally very strong.
Okay, that makes sense.
But the trivial things, like, the color of a random car that drove past you on the street, those form very weak connections.
Right.
During sleep, the brain applies a global reduction to the baseline strength of all synapses across the board.
So it just weakens everything equally.
Exactly. It just turns down the volume on everything. And because it weakens everything equally, the weak, trivial connections fall below the threshold of viability, and they are physically pruned away.
They just vanish.
They vanish. The strong, important connections are also weakened slightly, but they survive the cut because their daytime signal was so loud to begin with.
Ah, I see.
This whole process rebalances the entire neural network, significantly increasing the signal-to-noise ratio.
So if the glymphatic system is the biological dishwasher, then SHY is essentially disk defragmentation on a computer.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, throughout the waking day, you have opened 100 different useless browser tabs in your mind.
Yeah, we've all been there.
Right, and if you try to run the operating system with all that junk-consuming RAM, the system just freezes. So sleep is the mechanism that closes the background tabs, deletes the temporary cache files, and reorganizes the hard drive so the machine boots up blazingly fast and highly responsive the next morning.
It ensures the brain retains its neuroplasticity. Because honestly, without that pruning process, we would lose the capacity to learn anything new the following day.
Yeah.
Our hard drives would just be completely full.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of biological ground today. Give us a high-level recap of the evolutionary timeline we just walked through.
Sure, the timeline really reveals a clear causal chain. Billions of years ago, proto-sleep emerged as a strict chemical necessity. It was a molecular clock allowing single-celled organisms to protect their DNA from UV radiation and manage corrosive metabolic exhaust.
Right, the early shift workers.
Exactly. Then, as life transitioned to simple multicellular organisms like jellyfish, that necessity evolved into a chemical signaling system. The buildup of adenosine forced exhausted local tissues into a resting state.
The bottom of approach.
Yep. But local sleep is deadly for complex animals facing predation. So evolution centralized the command structure. The SCN began synchronizing the entire organism, which led to the behavioral adaptation of slumber, basically finding a safe place and lying still to protect the body during its vulnerable maintenance phase.
The behavioral fortress.
Exactly. And finally, this perfectly synchronized shutdown allowed for the evolution of specialized mechanisms in our massive brains, specifically the glymphatic system flushing out neurotoxins and synaptic downscaling organizing our neural architecture.
This completely upends how we should think about our nightly routine. We do not sleep simply because our minds are tired, or we just need to dream. Sleep is a daily, non-negotiable ritual of molecular repair.
It really is.
It's a mandatory biological price we pay to counteract the constant forces of entropy tearing at our cells. From ancient microbes to modern humans, it remains the hidden foundation of biological survival. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Stay curious, and we'll see you next time.